I have a leg length that I've been aware of for a long, long time. I have to sometimes put a little bit of a lift in my shoe. I can combat it with an orthotic that limits my pronation need, let's say, so I don't drop quite as much as my foot's reaching to the ground. It elevates me up a little bit, but it's not perfect by any means, right? So, but the point of the matter is, if we would just go after me with cues, that's not the problem. You can cue me all you want in the world. I'm going to continue to have that asymmetry due to the fact that one leg is not functioning as the same length as the other.
Hey everybody, Doug Adams here with Scott Greenberg from Readiness podcast. Big news, huge news. This is like earth-shattering. Make sure you're sitting down or you are in a place that you're not going to like drive off the road here. So prepare yourself. Scott Greenberg is training for a 5K right now here. He is a runner right now. I am thrilled about this. Scott, tell us about your running experience.
I decided to take the red pill and turn over to the dark side, and training for a 5K with the fam. We're gonna do it at the beach, so it's gonna be nice and hot, and
flat,
and hopefully flat. Yeah, that's what I'm hoping for. So yeah, I'm officially a runner now.
Nice. All right. What are you enjoying? What are you not enjoying here? What are you noticing here?
I'm enjoying finishing, and I'm not enjoying starting. How's that?
We were talking a little bit before we got on that Scott was saying that his first mile is the worst mile.
First mile is the worst mile. After that, it gets going. It's not as bad. I've been running on a treadmill in my garage in the summer in Florida, so it's a little hot. So
yeah, that's not necessarily advisable. Yeah.
No. I'm trying to really just kind of make it really difficult for myself early on, so that when I do actually take it outside, it'll be like a breeze, right? So
acclimating to heat, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Trying to keep the variables, under control. Trying to keep my speed constant, the terrain constant. Trying to, just build up the capacity right now. Trying to keep everything else at bay. So no, it's been a good journey. I'm only running about three days a week, getting my steps in and still lifting pretty good. So all of that's going good.
Nice. Yeah. So we were saying like the first mile, worst mile is a common thing. And this is something, a lot of times I get asked, hey, what's the difference between professional runners and recreational runners? What do you see? The first mile is intentionally very slow for more experienced runners there, that they really do see that it's like, give yourself some time to ease into it, get into there. I mean, we know it, at least if the first 2 or 3 minutes, you're going to be in oxygen debt for that. So that is one of those things that we were just talking about before, that even if you know it, Scott knows that too, right? It's still hard sometimes because you want to get up and go and you think you're fresh and you should be just going there, but you got to start that first mile way slower than you even really think.
Mm-hmm. And that's why so many runners actually go out for a run before they race, right? Is because they're trying to build up that system and really just try to acclimate to the activity, and just this way when they do start the actual part that counts, it's not as big of a shock to the system.
You know what I should look up, and maybe somebody can leave a comment if they know this. I'd be really curious. So I know going back to my exercise phys classes from undergrad, that for the first 2 to 3 minutes of an aerobic activity, you're in oxygen debt. It takes a little bit for your body to be able to produce enough oxygen or deliver enough oxygen to the muscles, and it takes a little bit there. But how long does that last for?
Mm-hmm.
So if you go warm up, right? Because I did this, I had a track workout earlier this week, and Drew Hunter and I were talking about this, and he said Drew's always like his first rep is his worst rep on the track type thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I did that, and sometimes more amateurs, like, you'll burn yourself out, and I've done this in the past myself. I just fly on that first quarter mile repeat, and then I'm struggling to just get around the track on the next ones. But I really did focus on that, of just running the first one a little bit slower and then getting a little faster each time. But, how long does it last? Like, if you warm up, how long is your body producing more oxygen, delivering more oxygen to the tissues? Does that last for 3 minutes? Does it last for 5 minutes? So if you're warming up for a race, you need to do some running ahead of time, right? Going into a cold.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And if you see the runners getting ready to go do a 10K on the track, race a 10K, they're got a good sweat going before they even start running. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh yeah,
So
like my guys that are racing, they're doing strides. They're
mhm.
pushing it, right? They
Yep.
are not just going out. And this is for,
It's not
hey,
like me hopping in my garage and just turning on the lights and going.
yeah. No, there's if you look at a lot of the Run DNA workouts in the Run DNA app that were created by a lot of the professional runners, and you read the description of those, the warm up is a lot more than most people even do for the
Yeah,
actual workout.
yeah,
And I think that that's a big difference, is really getting the body prepped for that. So I'd be curious. Maybe we'll have to do an episode on that, because that would be a fun one, kind of to
yeah,
think about, like what timing of warm up. When should you
yeah.
do that?
No, I think it's great, and even if you think about it, like personally, like with lifting weights, I always find that my first working set
Yeah.
is so much more challenging than my second working set.
Oh
My
yeah.
second working set always feels so much better, whether it's because I'm acclimated to the weight that I'm actually going to be working with, so that feels good. I'm
Yes.
even more warmed up than I was prior. It just for me always that second set is really the is go time set for me.
Oh yeah.
It just feels better.
Yeah. Yeah, and I for injury perspective too, like lifting, I've got a little left shoulder issue I've been dealing with for more than I'd like to admit. And it's like, if I had to learn, okay, reduce the weight by like 20 to 30% for that first set, just to
Mhm.
like get the tissues ready, and then you can bump it up. But if you try to go heavier weight on that first one, it's not good.
Even when I even Doug, when
Yeah.
I warm up and I'm warming up with significantly less weight, and I pyramid myself up to the working
Yeah.
set weight, that first working set typically again does not feel as good as
Doesn't feel
that second one. Yeah. So
like,
even
how am
though
I
I'm
ever going
warm,
to
it's
lift
just what's
20%
that?
more than this? It's like, yeah, how am I ever going to lift 20%,
Yeah.
30% more than this during the work set?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then it
So
happens. So, well, Scott, we're going to have to hear about, what's the goal for the 5K? Do you have a
oh,
goal? Do
time,
you like finish,
finish,
finish?
beat the family. That's it.
Are you
That's
going to
it.
beat Eric, your brother?
Oh no, Eric, no, 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 no. The wife and kids are gonna do it with me.
Okay. All right.
Yeah,
There you
but,
go.
but but my daughter and my wife just finished a half marathon, so they've got that on me. So,
Oh.
this will be a walk in the park for them. It'll be a run on the beach for me.
Have you noticed a difference in how you feel? Like, even your performance, weightlifting, have you, as you've added in anything, has anything stood out about how you're functioning, or,
No,
yeah.
no, not really. First couple of days, I was honestly, I was a little sore. I was a little
Yep.
sore, and I have to be real um, aware of how I program my leg days in with my running. So that's something
Yeah.
that I typically get pretty sore after my leg days. So I'm
Yeah.
trying to do my running. So I usually do my legs on Friday, and I try to do my running on Monday, maybe Monday, Thursday. I'm running 2 to 3 times a week, so I just got to be
Okay.
careful as to how I program it in. But usually, I'm pretty sore after like Sat. There's no running. If I do run, maybe I do Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Run before I lift on Friday, so run
Yep.
before I lift my legs, which again isn't always the greatest because again I'm fatigued. But
Yeah.
something to think about then, and that I've been playing with a little bit as I've been doing this.
Yeah, hard days hard, right? Easy days
Hmm.
easy. Trying to
Yep.
incorporate that in. I know I lift most of the time I lift legs on the days that I do harder workouts. And
Hmm.
I know I'm sacrificing a little bit of both doing it that way,
Hmm.
but I think managing it in with lifestyle, or, I'm running about 5 days a week or so. And that's, the, that's a challenge, trying to fit that in with work life and family life and those types of things too. So you have
Yeah,
to keep them the
I'm
same.
lifting 5 to 6 days a week. So that on top of my my run, plus the walk. So I do my run also includes when I'm done. I do like probably a 30-minute run and then probably another 30-minute walk after that. So that's a good hour worth of
That's a
quote
great way.
unquote cardio.
Yeah.
Either on top of my run. I try to again do it either on an off day, one of my off days from lifting. So I'm doing something physical every single day, or I'll do it
Yeah.
before I lift my legs. So that's a long day too. So Friday is a good day for me to do that because again, I don't have to worry about getting to bed early. I can do it after work, and then I have all the time I need. So that's been pretty good.
Are you doing uphill walking on the treadmill, or you're just doing
Sometimes.
flat?
Both,
Yeah.
both. Hmm.
Yeah, especially adding that extra cardio and getting back to or staying in that zone 1, zone 2 with some uphill walking is a great way to add some additional cardio while reducing the stress on the tissue. So
One
that's
thousand
a
percent.
yeah,
I walk every day. So,
yeah,
I don't classify, I try to get my steps in, or I try to get on my treadmill. And when I do get on the treadmill, I throw the TV on and I do walk uphill, and
yeah,
don't hold on, and just kind of nothing crazy, 2.5 to 3.0 on a 7, 8, 9, 10 incline. Not terrible.
yeah, yeah. Nice.
Hmm. Yep.
All right, let's get to the topic for the day here
Right.
then. So now that we've got the update, we're going to follow Scott's running and see how he's doing here.
Hold,
But
hold me
now,
accountable. Good. Hold me
yeah,
accountable.
yep. Now
Uh-huh.
it's out there. It's out there in the
Uh-huh.
world. You got to run this 5K here, and I'm going to ask you how it
I've
went.
run a 10K before. I've done that,
Yeah,
so it's not a matter of me being able to do it. I'll do it.
just how well.
I'm just gonna bitch and moan the entire process of training to get there, so it'll be fine.
Yeah, yeah. Even if you know everything about the sport, sometimes it's still hard to apply. So
Yep. Yep.
yeah, yeah. All right. Well, topic today, we're going to talk about another one of the gait categories and go into probably the second most common. If overstriding was the category we talked about last time, and collapsing is going to be the second most common one that we see. And we're going to see that a bit of this one's pretty recognizable when you look at it. So if you're walking or you're going along and you see somebody running and you're watching their form, one of the easiest ways to identify somebody collapsing would be those knees touching. And there's not much space in between the knees. But it is a multifaceted type category where collapsing can happen at the pelvis, at the hips, at the knees, at the ankles. And we can see that it's kind of a multivariate factor there, but you definitely know it when you see it. And we can quantify it as being at any one, but commonly it's at all of those joints at the same time. Where if you start collapsing at the foot, at the ankle, you're going to start to see some at the knees, even up to the hips. It just depends on where your weakest spot in the chain is, about where you're seeing it most there and what's driving it there. So, Scott, what do you see with collapse? How do you identify? What do you see more collapsing happening from the foot or from the hip, or where do you see it mostly generating from, or some kind of combination of that?
I think for me, it's easier just from my experience and what I tend to like to look at. I tend to notice it more at the foot and ankle, because that's where my
Hmm.
eye goes first.
Yeah.
You definitely see it at everything you said there is 100% accurate. You'll see it at the rear foot. You'll see that calcaneus go into eversion. You'll see the forefoot move into abduction. You'll see the classic too many toes sign.
Yep.
You'll see loss of that knee window. You'll see the pelvic drop kind of situation occurring. Sometimes you'll see that femoral internal rotation. But mainly, for me, I'm looking at that too many toes sign or that rear
Yeah.
foot eversion that kind of then dictates what happens up the chain, or vice versa. But that's what I tend to cue on that.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the things about the collapsing, and I think when we first started teaching courses, this was an aha moment for a lot of people. And why, with a collapser, it's really important to look at something like the runner readiness assessment and understand where somebody's mobility and strength deficits are. Because it's very common that when you talk about a collapser, the first thing that comes to mind for somebody about, if you said, well, why is that person collapsing? 9 people out of 10 are going to say, oh, they must be weak in the hips or they must be
Mhm.
weak somewhere. But in reality, it can be a mobility issue just as much as it could be a stability issue.
100%.
If you're seeing that somebody has a stiff ankle, which is common amongst runners, right? We use the posterior chain a lot. You get tight, you get limited in your ability to go into dorsiflexion, then you're going to still find a way to get that foot to the ground, especially that first ray and that big toe. So that's where the too many toe sign that Scott's talking about, you're going to see those toes out and they're getting down to the ground that way. And that's just the only way that they can get to the ground because they don't have it. So we
Hmm.
can't make an assumption with this person that they are weak because we don't know until we look. And I think that that's a huge takeaway, that a lot of people that go through the certified running gait analyst courses, it's a little bit of a light bulb of like why the runner readiness assessment and the gait categories are so important together as opposed to just isolated, because that stiff ankle could be contributing to the collapsing 100%.
And here's the thing to also think about is that if you don't address the fact that it is not a true weakness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, that body is doing what it's doing as a compensatory means, right?
Yes.
So it's a compensatory strategy to deal with a restriction. Whereas oftentimes when you're weak, it just kind of happens, right? But if you're
Yep.
tight, you're almost kind of figuring out a way in which you can kind of go through the motion and allow you to do the activity you're needing to do. So by locking down the foot, let's say you go in
Mm-hmm.
there and you say, hey, this person's collapsing or they're quote unquote pronating excessively, and you
Yeah.
go in there and you give them a stability shoe or an orthotic. Now you've basically locked up a joint that's compensating on top of a fact of another joint that's not doing what it should be doing. And now you're having you've taken away that person's ability to compensate. And
Yeah.
that compensation is now going to have to occur somewhere else, which isn't necessarily their true original strategy, which may be problematic.
Yeah, and that's a good segue into like why is this bad? Why is collapsing challenging on the body? Where when we talked about the overstrider often being high forces, we can see higher forces in the collapser too, but a
Mhm.
lot of times what we're seeing is misaligned forces. So Scott's talking about it at the foot and the ankle, and we're seeing some of those things that could be contributing to it. But same thing at the knee, when the forces shift, and when you get enough, like when we run, it kind of forces us into a varus type position, so more of a knees apart type position. But
Mhm.
if you get into enough collapsing, then the moment arm switches, and it actually puts us into more of a valgus moment, and that it's like self-feeding, that it continues to put you into more of a valgus position. I
Mhm.
think that that's what we see here, is that it's not necessarily that the forces are always so high, but they can be. It's that the forces are now acting in a way that the tissues aren't necessarily aligned to absorb that, and it can put some stress on the body. And I think the quote that I often cite from some of our courses, and I forget the author, so we'll have to see if I can accredit them somehow, but basically, some of the collapsing mechanics that we see reduce the capacity of bone to 59% of its original absorbing capacity, which is not enough to run downhill if you're collapsing. That's like that means that basically if you're collapsing and you run downhill, you're causing micro stress to that bone,
And
that
just think
it's
downhill running causes just in and of itself causes more stress to the knee, right? So
right.
if it's causing more stress to the knee going downhill, and then you're putting a position on the knee that isn't necessarily optimal,
Yep.
extreme valgus, etc. Now you're in a whole heap of trouble. So I think that's compounded in that situation.
Yeah. All right, so Scott, take us through some of the injuries that we typically see with this. Again, we've talked about it's not always that with any category we can say, oh, this is if you collapse, you're going to have this one injury. But, how can this relate to common injuries that we see in
I'll
runners?
start at the bottom of the chain and work up, and this is honestly I've seen all of it relate to this. I've seen
Yeah.
metatarsalgia, I've seen plantar
Yeah.
fasciopathy, I've seen Achilles tendinopathy, I've seen stress fractures and medial tibial stress syndrome, anterior knee pain, hip pain, sacral
All of
issues. Yes,
them. Yeah.
yes, 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 yes. Everything can be related to this. And if
Right.
you think about, exactly the shear forces, the transverse plane motions that are occurring, whether it be at the metatarsals, due to the too many toes sign, that medial whip that we see, putting their plantar fascia in an extended position, right? As the foot goes to toe off and the heel is more everted and the arches collapse, it really elongates the plantar fascia. Then you're talking
Yep.
about the Achilles, which likes to be more vertical. It tends to be more angled at this point as your heel goes into more eversion. Then we already talked about the tibia rotating internally excessively as a result, which again creates more pulling of the posterior calf muscles as well. We know that most stress fractures
Yeah.
and such is more muscular related than necessarily related to impact. So it's the
Yep.
pulling on the bone. So again, it's not optimal there. And then we start looking at patellofemoral tracking issues and the position of the patellar tendon. all things that are not necessarily optimum for traditional loading.
And I think that that's an important point, because when you're talking to a runner, you're doing a gait analysis, and then you're talking to them about, hey, the so what of what are these mechanics mean and why are they contributing to their injury, that it's really easy, if you understand the biomechanics and just some basics about stresses on the body, that it's like, yeah, and you have to describe it that way. You have to describe it simply, to just say, hey, you know what's happening to your Achilles is your foot's turning out, and now instead of loading the tendon straight up and down, now you're wringing it out like a towel. And that's not good for it. And that's going to put stress on the body. And those are called shear stresses on the body and torsional stresses. So explaining that to the athlete is really important, so that they understand the magnitude of what fixing those mechanics can really make a big difference. So
Right.
leading into that, how do we fix collapsing, right? Like, what do we do with it? Can we just strengthen the hip?
No.
No, no,
No.
absolutely not. And that study
No.
has been done numerous times. Like, you
So
can't
here's the
strengthen your
thing.
way out of form.
You can't, no, but what you can do is you can build up your
Increase
capacity.
capacity.
And by
Yeah, it's
building
not
up
that
your
strength is not
capacity,
important.
you may be masking the
Yeah,
effects that you think you're doing. So, oh, by strengthening the hip, yes, I got the hip stronger, therefore, they're not collapsing anymore. No, the hip is stronger and therefore it's able to tolerate a little bit more,
right.
and therefore it may not be the thing that breaks down first. But that's why, again, I always think, from the way I treat collapsing mechanics, I tend to go after the low hanging fruit again, not necessarily addressing those specific, I'm going to call it frontal plane or transverse plane movements. But I do
Yeah.
think, in my opinion, like sagittal plane variables lead, in my opinion, oftentimes to frontal plane and transverse plane compensations.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an important point, right? So when we run, people think of it as a straight line activity. But in reality, it's not that we're single plane athletes as runners. We have the forces of gravity pulling us in the frontal and transverse planes as well. So you have to overcome that. And if you think of and we're kind of generalizing with some of this stuff, but if you think of collapsing as an issue, it's a postural issue where you can't maintain postural positioning against the forces of gravity that are acting on the body when you run. So the idea with fixing collapsing mechanics is, how do I get the person into the posture that I'm really looking for? And to Scott's point, I agree. I look at sagittal plane because sometimes our sagittal plane postures are setting up our frontal and transverse plane positions. And
Yeah.
it's not that it's the only thing that we're looking at, right? We can look at cues and exercises and things like that that do look at frontal and transverse plane. But if they don't have some of the sagittal plane mechanics, like, hey, what's the shin look like when the foot hits the ground? What position are they in? If they're not in a good posture to start to dynamically accept load at the point when they hit the ground or throughout the whole stance phase, we need to address a lot of that first, because
Hmm.
those are often precipitating factors for what is going to happen after that point.
Yep.
Yeah. So cue wise, and when we think about it, we have to think about those first. I am going to look at what do they look like landing? And if they're not landing in a good position, even if they're not necessarily overstriding, are they in a good position? Like, they might land close underneath the body, but if they're landing in a super straight knee position and it looks like they're not using any of the braking musculature to absorb some of the forces, we need to teach them how to do that first.
Hmm.
And we might see that the collapsing improves itself that way without even needing to be cued, because it's the weak link in the chain rather than the driver.
Hmm. Yep. Agreed. Agreed.
And then we can do it like the second part of that, because it's a postural issue. I think it's also really important for the collapsers to give them the postural awareness. That is a key with gait retraining and changing it there, that they need to know what they're doing and how it feels to not do that.
Hmm.
I think that's a big part of it there, that we really do need to be able to say, "Okay, listen, your knees are collapsing inward. This is what's happening." That's where, like, I did a gait analysis last week on a young high school runner who was having some collapsing issues and really having some, like, you know, referred out for an MRI because I think there's something else going on here, just the demographics and things like that. But had real no clue that she was going into excessive hip adduction. And one of the things that I did is I used taping, like a hip spica tape, to just show her what it felt like to not go into hip adduction. She's like, "Oh, yeah, that's what I want." Then I take the tape off and I give her a cue, and it's like much easier for her to do. I
Mhm.
think that's the challenge because collapsing mechanics can be hard to change if you can't get them to experience and understand what you're asking. Because we look at something like pelvic drop. Think about that. How many, we're talking about 5 degrees of pelvic drop on one side and 7 degrees on the other side and a 2 degree asymmetry. And we're trying to get them to be aware of like 2 degrees of pelvic drop. That, like, 2 degrees is like, I don't know, my finger's straight or 2 degrees. I can't tell you right now.
Yeah,
So
and
how
that's
can they
and
do
that's
it?
why I think the chicken or the egg or the way in which we need to go after some of those things is I think sometimes when you try to give a cue to correct some of that, it's so minute and so difficult that I think you're going to create problems oftentimes in other areas due to them
Mhm.
trying to stiffen or
Yeah.
not run relaxed as they necessarily should be. We don't want them to be like loosey goosey per se, but if they're not coming up with good strategies to address a
Yeah.
small change in motion, that's why I think certain things are just easier, and you're going to get a lot more bang for your buck, and you're going to be less likely to cause other issues such as quicker cadence, shorter stride, direction of the knee drive. All of that to me is a lot easier to feel and to kind of
Mhm.
replicate as opposed to think like your pelvis is a soup bowl and don't let the soup come out. I don't know. I guess that can work
I
for some
use that
cases.
cue.
But I'm not saying
Yeah,
you
no.
can't use the cue, but I'm saying,
Yeah.
in the whole scheme of things, a cue like that is it's difficult because again, I think I think it can create some other issues I found. It's just people have a hard time with their midsection and their hips kind of trying to gain stability if that's not truly the issue, because again oftentimes that we find the hip is just doing what the rest of the body is telling it to do due to some of the other mechanical issues and overstriding and whatnot. So
Yeah.
um it's just something to think about. Again, that's why I just go to the sagittal plane stuff first. It's just easier,
Yeah.
and I think you do less harm with it that way.
Yeah, and I use a cue like the bowl of soup cue that Scott was talking about after I've given them drills for postural awareness, and I
It's
think
like
that that's a key. Like I use the wall drill all the time
mhm,
in people that are collapsers because
mhm,
I want them to get in that position because we can't slow the running down, and I want
mhm,
them to just feel like the difference in their pelvis, and until they can feel that, I'm not going to put them back on the treadmill and ask them to do it while they're running if they can't do
right.
it while they're leaning against the wall.
I agree. So think of it this way too. So, when somebody's running and they develop pain in their foot, let's say, and they have a race and they're middle of the race. So what
Yeah.
do? They compensate and they run. They actively run on the outside of their foot or another part of their foot,
Mhm.
right? And what are you
Right.
doing in those cases? Oftentimes you're creating more problems because you're
Yeah.
doing something forced. And I think sometimes when you start trying to force certain movements, you end up causing more problem than it's worth.
Yeah. But it isn't like we do need to address these things because we do have literature. Like there's been some articles that showed for every degree difference in contralateral pelvic drop, you're 80% more likely to be injured.
The
So
question
if
is, how
you've
do
got,
you address it
yeah,
though? The question is, how do you address it? So
how do you
again,
address
I'm
it?
not
Yeah.
I'm not going to take a runner and say that's everting excessively and say, okay, I want you to invert your foot more when you hit the ground.
Right.
That's a
No,
recipe for
that's
disaster,
the
right?
internal cue that is just gonna lock them up and make them super stiff, and they're gonna feel
Correct.
like a robot running,
Correct.
right? You
Correct.
need the type of cues that are like, "Hey, a lot of times I don't like, sometimes people get a little slouchy when they run, and they're kinda a little lazy when they run, and I'll tell them to run long, not tall, I'll tell them to run long like a ski jumper, just to kind of engage some things while they're running. And that's a cue that makes a big difference sometimes in that pelvic drop, where
Mhm.
people just start to be a little bit more aware of their position. Like if you make yourself really tall, you have to be able to do that. But again, I'm doing drills with them first. I'm slowing them down. I check a lot of times with collapsers, can they actively tilt the pelvis?
Mhm.
Can they go into an anterior and posterior pelvic tilt just in
Mhm.
standing, let alone while they're running? Because that is a metric we measure with 3D a lot too,
And
with
here's the
the
other thing that
collapsers.
I actually deal with, and I've actually looked at it in my metrics. I've been using some IMUs as we talked about,
Yeah,
when I run a little bit, pretty easy for the home. And I have a leg length. I have a leg length that I've been aware of for a long, long time. And my
yeah,
right foot is definitely functioning shorter than my left. I think it's definitely a true leg length, but I'm sure there's some components of some functionality around
so
it as well.
functional.
And um and I know that I collapse more on the right side. I do.
Yeah,
And so how have I tried to combat that? I have to sometimes put a little bit of a lift in my shoe. I can combat it with an orthotic that limits my pronation um, uh, uh, need, let's say, so I don't drop quite
yeah,
as much as my foot's reaching to the ground. It elevates me up a little bit. Um, but it's not perfect by any means, right? So,
yeah,
but the point of the matter is, if we would just go after me with cues, that's not the problem, right? You
yeah.
can cue me all you want in the world. I'm always, or I'm going to continue to have that asymmetry due to the fact that one leg is not functioning as the same length as the other.
The trick is, and what you're doing and what I was talking about earlier is make sure that you're checking to see if it has the effect that you want. You
Hmm.
have to be doing test retest with this,
Sure.
right? Looking at those things because if you put a lift in somebody's shoe and it's theoretical and you're not measuring, you're not seeing did it actually change. Like if I tape the person and make them worse, and that like I needed to know that, but I knew that she dropped 4 degrees of hip adduction as soon as I taped her, and I was like,
Hmm.
"This is effective. This is something that makes a big difference in her form. Now, how do I get her to do this on her own?" But we
Hmm.
have to like that gives me a standpoint, and this is maybe a good point. I don't think we've talked about this with the categories yet of how we match up some of the runner readiness and the gait categories. If you're seeing mobility deficits as a recurring theme in somebody that is going through a runner readiness assessment, and then you get and see collapsing mechanics, do you think they're going to be able to fix their mechanics while they're up on that treadmill?
No.
Or no, we're going to see like somebody that has mobility restrictions might need more intervention, whether that's manual therapy or needling or strengthening exercises, anything that's going to get them more control over their motion and more mobility. They need that first, but that's not the only thing they need. You still have mobility is not ability either. You still then have to do their gait retraining and get them to be aware of that after they have that capacity. Whereas if we look at somebody that has a recurring theme of stability issues, which most people would probably speculate with a collapser, that person might be able to do the cues for a brief amount of time before they fatigue out. And they might not have some of the spatial awareness that they need too, where all of a sudden you ask them to do a certain cue. And even if it's a cue, like Scott said, of like, hey, run soft or pretend that you're running on hot coals just to get them to reduce their ground contact time. Because I'm surprised you didn't bring up ground contact time with collapsers as a
Hmm.
cue here.
It is.
Uh,
Mhm.
yeah, because reducing the ground contact time means less time to go through excursions with it. But no matter what, if you're using one of those cues, it is important that you're testing like, hey, that person in the stability is only going to be able to do it for a short amount of time. And you might see that their ground contact time for the first 5 seconds when they run is 200 and then 210, 220, 230. Great. That means that's a good cue for them, but they need more capacity to be able to do it.
Mhm.
Yeah. I was waiting for you to say ground contact time. Scott
Well, again,
loves
it's part of
ground
that
contact.
sagittal plane mechanic stuff, right? So
It
somebody
is. Yeah.
overstrides, if they're overstriding, they're spending too much time on the ground. And then the way
Right.
the body adapts to prolonged loading is by collapsing to absorb the stress and
Yep.
shock. And there your collapsing mechanics right there. But again, it all boils down to getting them to land as close to the center of mass as possible, getting them off the
Yep.
ground as quick as possible. Don't allow for a lengthened backside portion of their mechanics, and
Yes.
and a lot of the other stuff takes care of itself. I'm a firm believer in that.
Yeah. Yep. You have to start with the basics and do the basics well first,
Hmm.
and then you can start to play with the other things, because there is a lot too. It's fun once you get beyond some of those basics. I think that's something I really have a lot of fun with, is now looking at that. And something I look a lot too is even starting to focus on timing of things. Like,
Hmm.
I look a lot, and I like to go deep into the graphs when I'm doing gait analysis and see some of those things. But I can see like a 40% timing difference for somebody as they go from peak hip flexion to initial contact, and look at some of those things. But I'm not focusing on any of those things until I have mastered some of the basics with it there. But you can look
Hmm.
at that and understand how are they changing, how are they affecting with it there. Because
Hmm.
I think it is important. But collapsing is such a common thing that we see. Um, and I think you can do a big service to somebody if you're doing 2D, just showing them what's happening, just to let somebody be aware of it.
And
Starting
collapsing,
with
it's varying degrees of it too, right? So
yeah,
collapsing again is the body's ability to absorb stress and shock. It's just a matter of how prolonged and exaggerated that collapsing
yeah,
mechanic is. Because again, it's like nobody is going to land directly underneath their center of mass. So everyone
they'd
is
fall on
quote
that face.
unquote an
Yep.
overstrider, but
Yeah.
same thing here. Everyone is going to collapse because it's important to collapse. The question is
Mhm.
how much they collapse and how
Yeah.
exaggerated the collapse and what are the
How
other
quickly they
compensatory.
collapse.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a good point too, because I think sometimes collapsing mechanics have been vilified,
Correct.
that pronation is a bad word
That's
and
right.
valgus is a bad word, but people will go
Correct.
through it. And it's part of our ability to absorb forces in the kinetic chain. And we need those mechanics, and we need to be able to go through some of that. And we shouldn't try to get somebody to not collapse at all. Just like you can't be an understrider without falling on your face, you couldn't necessarily be a non-collapser at all without putting a lot of stress on your body. That's going to lead
Hmm.
to some issues. I mean, yeah,
Right.
you're going to get fifth met stress fractures and fibular stress fracture. You're going to see all sorts of things on that lateral side of the body if you
Right.
don't go into any bit of absorption that way too. So there is too much of a good thing or too much reduction of something too.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And but another good point too that I think I just maybe wrap up and see if Scott has any final comments. But I think it is also important to say that although we are saying strengthening doesn't change mechanics, strengthening is really important for this. And what I find with this group is that they need help learning to activate certain muscles and to
I
do
agree with that.
exercises appropriately. And before you do a lot of heavy strengthening, even with this person, which we do
Hmm.
want you to get to, you need to make sure that they have the ability to uh, do the exercises and feel the exercises appropriately in the appropriate muscle groups.
Hmm.
I think
Agree.
that's key. I think that that's something where people are quick to jump to strengthening here because, like, oh, we got to increase capacity. But then they're doing these step ups and, like, where do you feel it? You're like, oh man, yeah, my quad and calf are killing me. And you're like, okay, what about, the posterior chain? You feeling anything there? You're like, no, no, I don't feel anything there. Right. Okay.
Hmm.
Let's teach you how to do this appropriate. Where are you putting
Right.
pressure on your foot? Okay. What are you doing here? Oh, you've got some hip flexor mobility issues. Yeah, and that's the other thing that we see a lot of commonly in this group. From a mobility standpoint, we talked about the ankle a lot. I think we have to look at the hip mobility a lot too. I think
Absolutely.
we're going to see hip mobility, especially in the hip flexors. I think we're going to see a lot of limited hip extension in this group that we're going to notice, even though that, like Scott says, they go into a lot of backside kind of mechanics there. They're they're not getting there appropriately. They're getting there through the lumbar spine and through the pelvis. They're not getting there through the hip. And that's going to put some changes on how the muscles are activating at certain points in the gait cycle. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a key thing to look at too, is don't forget its mobility is part of collapsing too.
Yep. Agreed.
Yeah. Any final words on collapsing, Scott? Any other thoughts? That was a nice little kind of outside the lines a little bit on collapsing and some things to consider.
No, you're going to see it. You're going to see it. But the way I address it, the way I go forward, it's not my first. It's not, even though I see the collapsing, it's not the first thing that I will necessarily always go after trying to correct in. It's kind of like go for the cause, not the mm-hmm. result of the cause. And I think oftentimes the way I view it is that the collapsing is oftentimes a result of something else. So it's the pain location, but not the pain problem. Right. So
yeah. And that's why, like in level 2 course, right? The level 2 certified running gait analyst, there's a hierarchy to this, and there is an overstrider collapser that's in there that we see mm-hmm. far commonly than somebody that's a collapser. But there's also, and we didn't go into it, but there's 3 different types of collapsers. So collapsing mm-hmm. can happen from different areas, and there's different things that collapsers need in order to address some of these mechanics too. So, but that's for probably another time, or go check out level 2 certified running gait analyst there. So, all right. Thanks everybody for listening. We're going to be getting Scott's updates on his marathon training. We're going to get him into a marathon. 5K. Yeah. All right. Thanks everybody for listening. Happy, healthy running. If you want more content, make sure you go over to rundna.com, get on our newsletter, find out about some of the courses and other things we're doing. Happy, healthy running. Thanks everybody.
Like what you hear? Leave a review of the show wherever you listen, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. RunDNA helps runners and running specialists through education and technology to identify each runner's unique injury profile to avoid setbacks and maximize results. The RunDNA podcast is produced by Ace Running LLC. The RunDNA podcast is intended for educational purposes only. No clinical decision-making should be based solely on one source. While care is taken to ensure accuracy, factual errors can occur. Always seek the guidance of qualified medical professionals before making healthcare decisions. Find us online at rundna.com.